Cox, and this is May 2nd, 2001, and I'm doing a video autobiography of Lib Minter. And Lib, if we can begin by describing your parents. Just tell us a little bit about them.
All right. My parents were born in Marietta, Georgia, and they were born during those years after the Civil War when the South was terribly poor. In fact, my father was in the first high school graduating class. He was born in 1880,
Amazing.
and she was born in 1878. And from the very beginning, they were deeply religious people, and especially my father and his mother, who was a passionate believer in missions, world missions. And from the time my father was just a small child, he always dreamed of someday being a doctor in China.
That's great.
And the result was that he, through a lot of difficulty in helping his younger brother become a doctor before he did, he prepared himself to be a doctor in China. And in 1909, he and my mother got married and started out on a trip across the United States by train, of course, and then onto a ship to go to China by boat. There was no other way. And I was born the next year in China, and at home, in the home of my father's sister and her husband. They were medical doctors also from the Presbyterian Church.
Wonderful.
And so that's where I began. And my father was sent to the city near Suzhou, China, which is near the coast, to start Western medicine. There was no medical facilities in Western medicine at that place, and he began this. The story was that his first patient came to him with an abscess on his leg, and my mother boiled some instruments on the kitchen stove, and
Wow.
they stretched him out and lanced this abscess and properly sterilized it, and of course it got well. In fact, his fame was so great that somebody once said, you know, that hospital that Dr. May runs, it's wonderful. It says you go there, you go to sleep, you don't feel anything, they cut you open, take what's inside and you wash it in the canal, put it back in again, and when you wake up, you're well.
That's great. So what was his name?
Fred Manger, a French name. He was three-fourths French. His father was totally French, and his mother half.
Good.
And they were not Huguenots, but they were along that period of time in history, you know, when they came. And his father was a teacher and a lay preacher, and my mother's father was a judge, a lawyer, and a judge in Marietta. Yeah.
So what was your mother's name?
My mother's name was Louise Anderson.
Great.
And so they went to China, and in due course, before World War I began, there were already 3 children in the family.
That's great.
I was the eldest, and the first, after getting started with medical work in Huchau, the World War I called on American Red Cross to do a lot of work, and they came to go to Siberia to care for soldiers that were in captivity under the White Revolution. And you see, the Russian Revolution was going on then. And so the head of the American Red Cross asked my father if he would come up to Siberia for a year, which he did, to Vladivostok, to the headquarters there, and taking care of soldiers that were in prison. And if you look towards the dining room, there's an icon, a Russian icon on the wall.
I see it.
Because when he got to Irkutsk, on going to bring out a trainload of infected soldiers with typhus, he found a monastery, a nunnery in Irkutsk that hadn't had any supplies for 4 months, and he was able to provide them with stuff. And in appreciation, the abbess gave him this icon,
That's
which
lovely.
is 1916. We have it, so we've had it that long, and I don't know anything more about it than that. But it's a family treasure, it's a memory of that time, you know,
That's wonderful.
way back there when.
So I presume the family didn't go with him when they went to Siberia?
No.
It was too rough, probably.
Oh yeah, and there would probably been no place
Yes.
to stay even, because it was very, you know, even where we lived in Huchau, we had no running water, no electricity, no telephone, no car, no bicycle. I figure it's about 100 years earlier in American society.
Yes.
What it was like, where we were. Of course, we had servants, or otherwise we wouldn't have been able to manage anything. You
No.
had to boil all the water you drank and boil the milk or pasteurize it, and I mean, just very careful to protect yourself from disease.
Yeah, I bet. So what was your birthday?
My birthday was September 4th, 1910.
That's
So
great.
this is, I'm into my 90th year now.
That's
so
wonderful.
I'm beginning to feel the weight of my years.
Well, I am a lot earlier, I must say, so
Yeah.
that's wonderful.
Yeah, you're a generation or two earlier than I am.
Yeah, well,
yeah.
One, maybe.
Yeah.
So you had two siblings?
I had three.
Three.
Three of us were born fairly close together, and then a few years later, the fourth one was, and that obviously from birth, there was a problem with her. And they took her to Peking, to the Peking Medical School up there, and they diagnosed it as actually then a thyroid deficiency, which they treated. People didn't know much about Down syndrome or retarded people. And she has lived all her life, has been very interesting in that in 1937, we had the war with Japan started, and well, I'm jumping too far.
No, that's fine.
Actually, John and I went back to China in 1937 to be missionaries of the Presbyterian Church, and my parents were still there. And my youngest sister was there too. And then the war with Japan began 3 or 4 months later, and anxious about what we might face in terms of evacuations and things of that sort, they sent her to America to a home. And she's been there ever since.
She's still alive?
She's still alive,
That's
and
great.
I go to see her twice a year.
That's wonderful.
Been
What's her
doing
name?
that for 35 years. Mildred Manger.
That's great.
And she's cheerful and happy and easy to, and it's made her whole home there, and they love her and care for her, so it's been a very blessed thing. Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
wonderful. And your other siblings? Who
My
were?
other siblings, one of them is not living, and then the other one is in Atlanta, Georgia, and is a music, her field is music. Yeah.
And what is her name?
Her name is Louise Cate now, C-A-T-E. Yeah.
That's great. And the one that's no longer?
She
living?
was in California, in let me see, San Pedro.
And what was her name?
Her name was Jean
That's great.
Seahorn.
4 daughters then.
4 daughters. 4 daughters.
Very
right,
nice.
yeah.
That's great.
I went to boarding school when I was 11 years old.
Wow.
My mother was a school teacher, and she decided that I needed more companionship with people, children my age, and so I look back on it and I think it was a very brave thing for her to do, and maybe brave for me to go. But I don't have memories of being fearful and nervous about it.
Where was the boarding school?
The boarding school was in Shanghai, and it was run primarily for the children of missionaries.
Very nice.
I went on a steam launch with the other people from Huchao that were in boarding school also at the same place, children, high school kids. And we had a little cabin that you stayed in, and 24 to 36 hours. If the tide was right, if the tide was against you coming out of the Yangtze River, why, it would make the trip longer. And I came home at Christmas, and then at Easter, and then in the summer.
Wow.
And we had correspondence by mail, and occasionally my father would come to Shanghai to get supplies for the hospital, and I would always see him then, of course. But basically, for 7 years, I was in that school.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and it was a fine school. Everybody that to graduate there were preparing to go to college someplace.
Were all of the students Americans?
No, they were a mixture of, far from that. I would guess at least 50% were Americans. And there were business families in Shanghai that had their children there, and there were always at least 5 to 10% Chinese.
That's great.
So that it was a good mixture, and we studied French and Chinese and had an excellent education.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, excellent education.
So tell me a little bit more about your life before you went to the boarding school. Do you recall much of that?
It was a very limited in area of space. We had a neighbor that had 3 children, and another neighbor that had 3 boys as children, missionary kids. And so, I think my mother was not very aggressive about helping us meet Chinese people. Of course, we learned to speak Chinese before we did English, and
Amazing.
completely proficient in both languages. And we had to make our entertainment. We had some very small libraries. Nowadays, if somebody was doing what that we're doing, you would have taken several boxes of books with you.
Yes.
But after the Civil War, I guess there just wasn't that kind of money. And so we would play games and do things and just entertain ourselves. And my
That's
mother
great.
taught me until I was ready for the 6th grade. That's
Wow.
when I went. And in the summertime, the heat was so bad and the temperature was so, and the humidity so bad that we went to a mountain resort about 24 hours from where we lived. And while we were there, of course, then there was a library and an English-speaking church, and we had a wonderful 2 full months, and sometimes a little bit more than that, up
That's
there in the
wonderful.
mountains in Moken Sand, where we met other children and had a swimming pool and
Oh,
tennis
wow.
courts, and that was
Great.
just really great stuff, you know.
That's
to-
wonderful.
to
Did your
enjoy.
father go with you, or?
My father did not go. My mother did, of course,
Uh-huh.
and my father sometime would come up for a day or a night and
Yes.
then turn around and go back again and have a little motor launch that took him back to the hospital.
That's
He was addicted to his work,
wonderful.
and
So,
was really a very, very innovative and skillful in terms of diagnosis and work with people. Yeah.
and probably far out of his experience going from the U.S. South
Oh.
to China, all different diseases.
Totally different, and I don't know how much preparation they had really, you know, in terms of, and it's interesting, that's an interesting question. I never thought about asking that question of them. But they had to go to language school the first year because, of course, no one spoke anything except Chinese among those
Sure.
places.
And you mean Mandarin when you?
No, it was a dialect called the Wu dialect, which I said about 100 million people speak, so it's not a little small pocket, you
Interesting.
know, yeah.
And
So-
that's what you learned growing
And that's
up?
what I learned also, right.
Uh-huh.
And now it's less and less in use, although anybody from the Shanghai area will understand it.
Interesting.
The kids are being taught in Mandarin in the schools now,
Hmm.
yeah.
That's interesting.
So-
So do you still remember it?
Yes, it's a less and less good. When I went back to China in 1990, and I was asked to speak in church or someplace like that, I
Mhm.
always had an interpreter because I
Uh-huh.
felt like I'd be embarrassing my folks that were listening.
Yeah.
I remember one time when I was talking to a group, and I said something and they all laughed, and I said, "What did I say wrong?" And they said, "You didn't say anything wrong, you're just old-fashioned."
That's great. With the recognition that you could completely fool me, could you say something in Wu?
當時我講中國話俾侬聽，不大意思意思，為此侬懂中國話，那麼侬有一個度問題，哪能可以曉得我講啥個咩事？
That's great. What is that?
I said, if I talk Chinese to you, there's not much point in that because you don't understand it. So how can you know what kind of things I was saying?
Because I trust you now that you've interpreted. That's great. So, do you have any striking memories from that period before you went to boarding school in Shanghai? Or striking people that you remember?
I really feel like primarily the people I remember are just those people right there next door on two
Yeah.
sides.
Uh-huh.
And of course, as they got older ahead of me, they were gone. And that was the reason my mother sent me as
I
early as
see.
she did, because that meant that I and my younger sisters and the little girl next door, who was the age of my younger sisters, was all only people there for me to be with. And
So-
she felt I needed more companionship.
And they were Westerners too?
Yes, they were
Were they-
Westerners. They were
Uh-huh.
Westerners. They were members of the mission people. One of them was a director in the school, and the other one was in the church. Yeah, and their families have been there. They were there when my parents got there.
Wow.
We were the next group of people came to Huchau, to that mission. That was a Methodist project, Methodist church. Yeah.
Interesting. So did the outsiders, the Westerners, have to live in a special area, or did you just congregate?
They did live in a special area because that's where they bought the property and
Uh-huh,
built
I see.
Western-style homes.
I see.
And it was right down in the middle of the city, of course, and my father walked to the hospital. That was
Great.
his exercise.
That's great.
And started out in a residence that they just took over in the middle of the city, and then had the dream of building this in a very fine hospital and nursing school. And it's still operating now under the military in China.
That's
Yeah,
wonderful.
So, it's still
So how did they fund the?
those were
office?
funded by funds that he had tried to raise when he would come to America. We have furlough every 7 years.
Wow.
You came to America. My first memory is pulling into Marietta, Georgia, when I was going to be 6 that fall. It was in June, and the family all gathered on the train station to greet us, after 7 years being away. And both of them, my parents came from large families. And getting out and just being bedazzled by how strange it was, like being Alice in Wonderland.
I bet.
And going into a drugstore and everybody giving us ice cream cones, which we'd never had before.
No refrigeration, no
how
ice cream.
and how we were so numb by what we were seeing, we couldn't finish the cones.
That's wonderful.
So that was my earliest memory of America.
That's amazing. So when were you last back there?
In China,
Or yes, to this town that you lived in with your parents?
1990. I
Oh.
went back, actually, after the war drove us out in 1949.
Uh-huh.
We stayed here in Texas. John served churches in Texas. And then we had, in 1982, the church in Houston sent us to China on a trip.
Wonderful.
And it was one of the first times after the Cultural Revolution. The Red Guards had closed all the churches and all that business was going on. And we went with a group of about 30 or 40 people. And this scroll behind me on the wall is a memento from that trip. The Chinese characters on it say, "Thou the spring wind, I the grass, on me blow."
Lovely.
And that was the theme that we had for our trip to China, and that was in 1982. And then in 1990, John had died in 87. My oldest son, who was 12 years old, and was sent to America during the war from when we were separated during the fighting. He and his wife were eager to go back and see what they could remember, and seeing we went together in 1990. But I'm in correspondence with Chinese friends in 3 cities
That's
around
wonderful.
the
So-
coast.
The home that you lived in, is that still there?
No, that's gone, and the home the home I grew up in is gone, but the home I lived in when we went back is
Yeah.
1937. It's still there,
Yeah.
yes, but actually it's been turned into medical facilities, so it's not really. And then part of it's been turned into a retirement home, and
Amazing.
we went to see it, but we didn't get to go inside it.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but the people that we saw were people that we had known early on
Oh,
in the church. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so it's been very meaningful and makes me realize that I'm partly tied to China and the people there and the church and so forth, just from sheer
Osmosis.
involvement,
Yes, of course.
with them, right.
That's interesting.
One of the things that was interesting and somewhat unusual about us was that in 1948, Fred, our oldest son, was 12 years old, and it was time for him to go to boarding school, where I had gone. And so we went and matriculated him here there in the 6th grade, I think it was. 6th grade. And then the war began and became closer and closer, and the Japanese, at that time the war was between the communists and the Chiang Kai-shek in China. And we were separated by the fighting and had no communication with Shanghai, where he was. And the State Department, just as they had ordered me out with 2 small children in 1940, were telling people to leave. So a family that we knew well and were worked with were going, and the people we left Fred in charge of decided the best thing to do was to send him on home. They just didn't know what things were going to happen. So we found out that he was gone after he'd left China even.
But that was unnerving.
And well, things were so catastrophic anyway. There's one more thing, but it did say, well, as soon as we can, we need to get back, and it was time for what we call furlough anyway. But that was quite a story. The man that brought us the letter first got stopped by the communists, and he got scared and he ate the letter so that they wouldn't find anything from the Westerners on his person,
Amazing.
and had to go back and get another communication to bring to us to tell us that Fred had gone.
Was it on rice paper?
I don't.
Because sometimes
Maybe it was. Yes.
sometimes it's wrapped
It's-
on candy.
Well,
The
it's
rice paper.
thinner paper. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I've still got the letter that he wrote us telling us that he was
Amazing.
going to and his passport and stuff
Wow.
like that in an album. Yeah.
That's amazing. Was the letter in English?
Yeah. Mhm.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah, we did all our, I taught the kids when we went back with children
Uh-huh.
in 1946. I had one in first grade and Fred in third or fourth. So we used a system of called the Calvert system out of Baltimore, Maryland, which has lesson plans and all that
Oh,
stuff.
wonderful.
And
Homeschooling.
homeschooling, yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So tell me, are there, again, I'm thinking about your early years, not just before you went to boarding school, but after. Are there any movies or anything that we could see today that would evoke?
No, the only thing we do have some movies of 1948 or so, but that's after John and I were there together.
Yes.
I don't think back in those days there were many people making movies.
No.
Maybe they were.
But
I don't remember anything about them.
Yeah, but what I mean is maybe Hollywood movies, but there are
okay.
period pieces, because there are a lot about China various times,
Yeah.
and I just wonder if any of them that you've seen
I don't remember.
evoked feelings of that period.
I think that the kind of life that we lived was such a slice of unusualness that there wasn't much that we would have seen in the movie that would have reminded us of it.
Very interesting.
Shanghai, of course, is a very large city,
Yeah.
and we had our very simple accommodations. The school got better. Later on, got to have a fine school plant, and it's still in operation as a research place in Shanghai for the government now.
Interesting.
But our life there at the boarding school, we had sports, we had our classes, we had friends, and we had and we got into Shanghai maybe occasionally when we wanted to go in with a group on Saturday or something of that sort. But much more like America, except it's boarding school.
Yes.
There were teachers, and you had a roommate, and you had rules that you had to go by, and of course I've got pictures of that.
Wonderful.
I've got pictures of the days that we were there, and then the days when we got back in '49.
That's wonderful.
46, yeah.
That's great.
I've just finished cataloging and listing 9 albums of pictures.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, so they can decide what to do with those after I'm gone.
Yeah, I hope when we finish here you can show me
I'll
some
be
of the
glad
pictures.
to,
Yeah.
especially one of them that's very unusual. Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
So what did you do when you finished the boarding school?
I came to America in June of 1928 when I finished high school. My parents had the dream that all of us were going to come to America by going around the world.
Oh, wow.
And so I was the first one. And 10 days after I graduated from high school, I was on a ship headed for Europe. And I went with another girl from my class and 2 single women missionaries. And we traveled from the 20th of June until the middle of September.
Wow.
And I went through 17 countries and had traveled and went into all sorts of different places. The boat trip from Shanghai down to Hong Kong, then to Manila, then to Indonesia, not Indonesia, but Ceylon and Malaysia, and then to cross to India and up the Red Sea.
That's
Quite a trip.
How old were the women that went with you?
They were in their 30s or 40s maybe, but to us they were totally ancient.
Yes,
We were high school kids.
but I was thinking that was rather brave of you and of your father to send you all on a trip like
we
that.
were so used to traveling, we never, in fact, when we went to China, we went by boat. The flight trip was only in we didn't make any trips by plane. Everything was by boat. So
Yes.
it's another era,
Yes.
another way of traveling and another way of doing things, yeah.
Yeah. I think the beginning of travel by plane was really World War II. I think that's when it began to take
That's
off.
right, and my father did some of that with that. He got involved with the Chinese government and was chief surgeon for the Flying Tigers in Kunming, China during
Is
the
that
war.
right?
You know, after he got shut out of China, out of the hospital, they wouldn't let him back in there.
That's
The
amazing.
communists wouldn't, yeah.
That's amazing.
So they've had a really interesting taste of different countries and places in life, you
That's
know.
so. What were your favorite countries on your?
Well, one of the things that I enjoyed,
Tour.
especially when high school, was not doing that, but during the war and the fighting, we evacuated to Korea for summer. And the beautiful beaches of North Korea, Wonsan Beach, and we spent a summer there that I can remember very vividly. Being
That's
able
great.
to swim in the ocean and be with friends there and be barefoot.
That's wonderful.
You can't be barefoot in China with infection. And just kind of like camping, you know,
Yes.
which was instead of being shut up in a house, which was a very special treat. That was my junior year in high school,
Interesting.
and I remember that very vividly. Yeah.
In the Middle East, you can't go barefoot because worms will come out of the
Well,
soil.
That's right. Well, that you can't in China either. We couldn't allow the kids to go. We weren't able to go barefoot at all. Yeah.
And I guess it's because it's further north that you could do that in Korea.
Well,
They
that's
have
interesting.
freezes there to
On
kill
the
that
beach.
worm.
Well, and we were on the beach. Maybe that was safer.
Yeah, could be.
I hadn't thought about that.
That's
But
interesting.
I don't remember any kind of protection against something like that, so it must not have been a problem.
That's-
Of course, with a medical doctor as a family, they were pretty
yeah.
up on things of that sort. Yeah.
And I think one of the largest populations of Presbyterians are in Korea now.
Korea has had one of the most successful, you might call it, program in terms of Christianity of any of the countries in the world. They've got the larger percentage of their population. They've got a more devout, more committed constituency than any of the other countries. In China, it was the Chinese thing since the war is over and they're in charge of themselves in the Christian church. It's grown dramatically.
That's wonderful.
Tremendous growth in terms of numbers of people in churches and so forth. Of course, it's not percentage-wise to 1 billion people. It
Takes a while to get 1 billion people.
takes a while.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So after your tour, when you were back in the States, what did you do?
I was registered in college, Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, which is the oldest women's college in the world. And it has ties with my family where some of them were on the board and things. And the girls in the family, cousins, they would have been, had gone there. And so I was sent there. I didn't have any, in my case, no choice of or discussion about the way, I think about the way they travel around now to see where they're going to go.
Yeah.
You know, oh, it's so different. And
That's
I was very content there, and I was already pre-med. I wanted to be a doctor.
Is that right?
I was my father had no sons, and I thought that's what I wanted to do, and so I took a medical course.
That's wonderful.
And after my sister came the second year, the next one in the family, and she went to summer school at Duke after that first year. And she came home from summer school and she says, I don't care what you're doing, but I'm going to transfer to Duke. And the idea of a coeducational school appealed to me anyway. So not any vocal disapproval, but obvious disapproval by my relatives. We picked ourselves up and transferred to Duke. However, the new dean of Duke had been at Wesleyan College, so he knew where we came from, and they received us without any problem about transfer or anything.
That's great.
So both of us graduated from Duke University.
That's great.
Yeah.
And you finished in pre-med?
Finished in pre-med and took an exam for Johns Hopkins and then got engaged to John and turned around. And went to Yale, went to New York to study for 1 year in a seminary, and then went to Yale to get a master's.
That's great.
In preparation for religious church work.
That's wonderful. So tell me how you met John.
I went to a weekend conference of students who were interested. It was called the Student Volunteer Movement, and this was in my sophomore, junior year. My junior year, so that'd be 1930. Gosh, that seems a long ways ago. And this was a weekend retreat sponsored by the little group in Wesleyan that were interested in overseas mission. Not necessarily just to go, but to be a protagonist for it. And he was on the national board and was traveling in campuses around. And so that's where I first met him. And I'll have to admit that although I dated a lot of other people, there wasn't anybody that ever came up to my interest in him. And actually, I think he came back to Austin and had an understanding with somebody here before it was all over. But 2 years, my senior year, we became engaged, and he hadn't finished Yale Divinity School, so I went to graduate school, and he finished his work up, and then we married and went back to Yale for a year so I could get my master's there.
That's great. So you met him at this meeting, and then
This weekend thing, and he visited the campus there, and we started writing to each other, but never sent a telegram, never sent a telephone call. It sounds so primitive and backwards. It's unbelievable almost now,
Well,
the way things are now.
no, it's just a different era. People
It's
didn't
a different world.
exactly.
The communications it's really changed. It's changed everything to me in terms of how
Technology.
you operate.
Technology, one, and abundance,
Oh.
two. The Cairo's book of LBJ talks about a school in near where he grew up that the high school couldn't afford to buy a football, so they had a fundraiser